Hello, and welcome to Overheard, the Foreign Policy Research Institute monthly podcast that explores the national security implications of intelligence activities, irregular warfare, and political warfare. My name is Phil Vasilevsky, and I am the director of FPRI's Center for the Study of Intelligence and Non-Traditional Warfare. Today, in light of recent world events, we're going to return to a topic we recently covered. Approximately 3 months ago, we aired a podcast titled Russia's Other War in Europe, which discussed Russian political warfare operations in Georgia and Moldova in advance of the October 2024 elections in those two countries. I discussed with our Georgian and Moldovan guests Russia's efforts, some open and some covert, to influence their elections so as to keep both Georgia and Moldova in the Kremlin sphere of influence. Today, we're going to return to the theme of Russian political warfare, and with the ability of hindsight after these elections, discuss what exactly Russia did in Georgia and Moldova, what difference it made in those countries' elections, and why this should matter to us in the United States. Previous Overheard podcasts have also discussed Russian, Chinese, and Iranian political warfare operations conducted directly against the United States. For those of you who may not have tuned in for those podcasts, at FPRI, we consider political warfare to mean the overt or covert employment of elements of national power, including cyber, economic, financial, informational, paramilitary, and political statecraft tools short of declared war against a hostile state or non-state actor to achieve political goals. In other words, this is international relations between countries in conflict and how they conduct that conflict below the level of open warfare. Russia today uses political warfare in the now independent states of the former Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact to co-opt political systems so that control over those countries' affairs is determined mainly in the Kremlin. It uses political warfare against other countries in the world, including the United States, to weaken their resolve to oppose those machinations. Russia's political warfare operations are part of a larger ideological conflict, one that echoes last century's Cold War between the free world and communism. That conflict is well described by authors such as Anne Applebaum and many others today as a conflict between democracies and autocracies. I agree with that description, but I also see this conflict in a slightly different light. For me, I see the issue in the terms of one word: sovereignty. In foreign affairs, either a nation is sovereign, has the agency to make its own decisions, or it is not. In its domestic affairs, the same applies. Either its people are sovereign, with the same ability to decide their own governments, or they are not. The issue we will discuss is what Thomas Jefferson once wrote in Philadelphia that, quote, "Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed," unquote. That is what we will be discussing today, the consent of the governed, and did that happen in Georgia and Moldova this past October. Joining us are William Hill, a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer who has served 2 terms as the head of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, mission to Moldova between 1999 and 2006. And also with us is Batu Kutelia, a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the former Georgian ambassador to the United States. Ambassador Kutelia was also a guest in our previous Russia's Other War in Europe podcast. Bill, Batu, welcome. My first question will concern Moldova. Bill, just before the elections in Moldova, you wrote the following in Foreign Affairs magazine. On October 20th, citizens of the Republic of Moldova will head to the polls for a combined presidential election and referendum on joining the European Union. Ahead of these votes, Moscow has mounted a campaign to support pro-Russian candidates and parties, weaken incumbent President Maia Sandu, and slow Moldova's moves to align more closely with Europe. Russian interference in Moldovan politics is not a new phenomenon. Moscow ruled Moldova for centuries and still considers it to be part of its exclusive sphere of influence, along with Belarus and Ukraine. For 2 decades, Russian President Vladimir Putin has sought to restore the influence that the Kremlin lost over Moldova after the Soviet Union collapsed, mostly without success. Now, Bill, since writing that, we've had the elections in Moldova, and you've just returned from a visit to that country. Has anything you've heard, read, or seen on the ground there changed your mind about what you wrote earlier before the election?
Well, first of all, Phil, thanks for having me on the podcast. Uh, Although Maya Sandu triumphed in the Moldovan elections and the country narrowly voted in favor of a referendum on EU membership, very little has changed in the Russian attitude towards Moldova, and one shouldn't have expected it. Russia is still looking to have Moldova in its, whatever you want to call it, sphere of influence, sphere of privileged interests, as Dmitry Medvedev said in 2008, or part of the Russian world, the Ruski Mir. Moldova faces parliamentary elections that have to be called by the end of next summer. And the Russian activities that we have seen, pronounced involvement in Moldovan politics and attempts to swing the votes of the electorate in favor of Russian positions, have not stopped, and they're not going to stop, as Russia is clearly continuing its quest to somehow install a favorable government in Chisinau and turn Moldova from the pro-European course that the country's generally followed for about the last 20 years toward a more congenial line towards the Kremlin. Uh, the results of the election were encouraging in one sense. It's a glass half full, glass half empty. The incumbent president, Maya Sandu, who is greatly respected and supported in Western Europe and from the United States, won re-election by a comfortable margin. The referendum to amend the Moldovan constitution to reflect Moldova's candidacy for EU membership and Moldova's policy of Euro integration passed by a much narrower margin. Both votes, although the result was the one that both Sandu and her party and those who were supporting Moldova in the West, the results were those that we wanted. They were much narrower than one would have hoped for, especially on the referendum. And large parts of Moldova outside of the capital voted very heavily against Sandu and against, not in favor of the EU referendum. So there is considerable scope for Russian meddling, Russian mischief, and Russian influence operations in Moldova. And it's going to be a problem as we face the campaign for the parliamentary elections to come next year.
Bill, was some of that meddling that was witnessed during the recent Moldovan elections?
Well, it's remarkable. I mean, I've seen it for years. When I was there working for the OSCE, the Russians tried to send political technologists to help Moldovan parties in campaigning and in skewing the vote. But in this case, the Russians have a Moldovan political party, coalition of political parties operating out of a headquarters in Moscow and St. Petersburg. A former oligarch, Ilan Shor, who was in exile in Israel for some time and early this year, moved to Moscow, who participated in a massive theft and scheme of money laundering in the past decade. Shor runs a political party and a coalition of other parties run out of Russia, financed with his money and Russian money that they give to him. And you see a parade of members of parliament and other political figures back and forth to Moscow, conversing, coordinating with Shor, with Russian figures. Also, during the campaign, the Moldovan police uncovered a scheme involving perhaps tens of thousands or more Moldovans, in which organizers were getting money from Russia through Russian banks and were buying votes, were paying Moldovans to vote the way the Russians instructed them to. And the money was it could be accessed by the people. They were paid off by given cards that they could redeem by going online banking through Russia. in order to evade international sanctions. These are some of it was a massive scheme. It was intrusive. It had people operating at all levels. There was a media campaign. It was really something quite massive and quite remarkable.
I'd say it was remarkable. There was always that 10% that didn't get the word about how to be paid because we had YouTube videos coming out that very day from Moldova of people saying, okay, I voted for Shore's party. Where do I get my money?
Indeed, you had Moldovans going to the polls and talking to Western reporters. I mean, I saw both reporters from RFERL and from BBC talking to voters who said, "Yes, I got 1,000 rubles or so many lei to vote, but I don't know where to pick up my money." It was really a gross, a very overt and massive involvement, and just something that is really remarkable to watch, and a real threat to Moldova's the integrity of their future elections.
Thank you, Bill. Ambassador Kutelia, you too have just returned from your native Georgia and were present during the election when the political party Georgia Dream won again a parliamentary majority. Can you tell us about the recent election there in your native land and what impact Russia had overtly and covertly in helping Georgia Dream stay in power?
Yes, the Georgian election was important milestone for Russia to finalize its state capture that Russia has been orchestrated for almost a decade in Georgia. So, in comparison or in difference to Moldova, Russia is maybe better positioned to finalize the state capture in Georgia because Russia managed to install in Georgia made in Russia oligarch Ivanishvili in power. So, and entire state institutions are under his personal control. He put there his personal loyalists, so Georgia state institutions are serving the purposes of Ivanishvili and his Georgian Dream government to consolidate power. And this election was intended to finalize or to legitimize Russian pro-Russian government in Georgia. So what happened? We barely can call what happened in Georgia election because even with the superficial analysis of the entire process, you could see that Georgian Dream was preparing to rig this election. All the state institutions and plus Russian instruments of overt or covert influence were assisting this process. So, for example, if we refer to the preliminary conclusions of observer missions and analysis that opposition parties did, for example, they observed almost a 40 type of different violations of elections. 85% of those violations were systemic, and they showed the final results that Central Election Commission, which is again under the political control of Ivanishvili and his personal loyalists have been appointed there. They showed a 13% difference with the exit polls conducted by in favor of the ruling party, comparing to the two exit polls that credible Western institutions conducted. That been never happened before because these polls were in the previous elections very accurate. And all those violations has been detected on 72% of all precincts all over the Georgia. So these statistics really show the anomaly, but the interesting factor here is that it's not just the badly managed elections. I think it was a very well administered rigging process where all the institutions conspired to grab the power, assisted by the Russian intelligence interference. So I rather call it a soft coup d'etat. So taking power to the by the political force which has no legitimacy, because in reality Georgian people voted differently, but through the manipulations Georgian Dream decided to grab the power. So, in a nutshell, it was an attempted coup d'etat. The process is not finalized. Georgians are still protesting, and internationally, nobody recognized these elections besides Maduro, Nicaragua, Russia, Iran, and North Korea.
Batu, you used the term state capture that I'd like you to explain in more detail for our audience, because this is a very important term, and you kind of referred to it also at the end here. What exactly is state capture, and what tools did the Russians provide to help with the state capture?
Yeah, state capture is the most pervasive form of corruption, where one person or a group slowly attempts to control most of the state institutions. In Georgian case, I think we are witnessing the most massive form of this state capture. Well, all the institutions, including the judiciary, are under the control of one person, the Russian oligarch Ivanishvili, and his proxies. And none of those institutions are able to perform what is their constitutional or legal mandate. And it happened slowly, step by step, when GD came to the power, and they were assisted through corruption, and the state capture was lubricated by the corruption, Russian money laundering, and also the most important component to it, the propaganda. Additionally, we've seen now also the violence against the opposition, political opponents, and activists. So these all tools were combined together to assist Ivanishvili and his proxies, this kleptocratic pyramid, which, like with umbilical cord, is connected to Russia financially, morally, and politically, to having decisive leverages on the country's future. While 85% of Georgians want to go to the West and be a democratic country, Ivanishvili and their proxies are dragging country towards Russia. And Russia is assisting them financially and also politically. One component was, you mentioned in your introduction, this fear-mongering, fear of the war as an informational operation. So while Russia captured 20% of territories in 2008 when they invaded Georgia. Then, after this, they attempted a state capture. And using the military or threat of use of force as a factor of influencing public public mood, and the fear mongering as a tool to assist the pro-Russian government to stay in power.
It's interesting you note that, yes, before we began recording, we were talking about the impact of the 2008 Russian invasion, which almost reached Tbilisi, on the Georgian people. Today, we're recording on November 21st, and one of the headlines in the Washington Post is "Fearing War, Georgia chooses a return to Russia's embrace." And I think this should be something we consider also when we look at Russia's operations and war, not just in Ukraine, but threats against other countries along its periphery. I'd like to return to Bill for a moment and Moldova. Now, Bill, in your introduction, you mentioned that Moldova is a parliamentary system and is going to have parliamentary elections before July 2025. That being the case, do you think Russia will make the same attempts to influence those elections in the same way? Or do you think Russia will admit defeat and not pursue operations against the Moldovan elections like they did this time? What's your opinion?
Well, Russia has not admitted defeat over 30 years as I've been watching their involvement in Moldovan politics, so I don't expect to see that now. The Moldovans that I talked with last week certainly are worried about it. They are looking at the results of the last election. They're looking at the contours, especially how the votes were distributed, places where Russian influence was apparently successful in the most recent elections, and where it might be successful or more successful in the upcoming election. And you're looking at least two or three major parties that have overt support from the Kremlin, as well as a couple of other parties that have a history of adopting or at least seeming to favor policies that lean towards more towards Russia than towards Central and Western Europe. So it's one expects, I certainly expect that there is going to be a real battle and it is going to be a real struggle for the current ruling party of Action and Solidarity, formed by Maya Sandu and allies during the previous decade, to maintain its majority or a prominent of the first position in the next parliament. And the real power in Moldova lies with the parliament. The president is power of the current president and of previous presidents who've exerted great policy influence has been that they've been heads of the party that control the parliament rather than presidential power in its own right.
Bill, there are certain elements in Moldovan society that do support um, the Russia approach towards world's affairs in closer ties with Russia. Could you briefly describe Moldova? Because it's a multi-ethnic country, a very interesting history. If in a couple of minutes you can compress 300 years of Moldovan history for our listeners and tell them what are the sources of support for Russia and for Moscow's approach within the country that Russia's able to exploit and use.
Well, the bulk of the population in Moldova are ethnic Romanians or Moldovans, Romanian speakers, but there's a considerable ethnic Ukrainian, ethnic Russian, Bulgarian, and Turkish Orthodox population. Moldova was liberated in the 18th and 19th centuries from the Ottoman Turkish Empire by the Russian Empire, and then Russia annexed what is present-day Moldova, Bessarabia, in 1812. So Moldova's been a part of the Russian world for at least 3 centuries, and there's a considerable influence of Russian language and culture. I've lived a total of maybe over 10 years in Moldova, off and on over the past 30 years, visited often. My experience is it's Russian culture that is more important there than overt support for Kremlin policies. Just because of the 2.5, 3 centuries of living next to Russia and as part of Russia, large portions of the population, even those with Romanian last names, Romanian ethnicity, speak Russian at home. They get their news from Russia. They like Russian movies, Russian music. And so they're oriented towards Russia. They're inclined to be favorable towards Russian culture, although they don't necessarily want to be ruled from Moscow. And it's been a collision of cultures as much as overt political ideologies that have really influenced the debate in Moldovan politics since they got independence in 1991.
Batu, kind of the same question. Just as in Moldova, the concept of balancing more towards Moscow than towards the West does have support amongst part of the population. And that support is not just manufactured by the Kremlin, but is often based on cultural, linguistic, religious, and or economic factors. As a matter of fact, when you and I met last year in Tbilisi, I interviewed you on this facet of Georgian politics. Could you discuss the basis of support for the Georgian Dream or GD political party and how Russian soft power, such as church ties, economic interests, the cult of Stalin, recent immigrants from Russia, etc., influences those traditional aspects of the Georgian electorate?
Yes, that's an important question. But also, I would like to refer to the title in the Washington Post that you just read, which says that the Georgians choose. Georgians did not choose pro-Russian government. It was not a Georgian choice. All the public opinion polls and exit polls prove that 60% of Georgians voted for the pro-Western opposition. But you are right, roughly 40% is a support of the GD. So if we deconstruct this 40%, mostly this support comes either through the administrative resources, through the corruption, or voter buying. Russia tried several times to orchestrate a pro-Russian political forces, and they never got traction more than single digit, even like around 5% maximum. Because the idea of pro-Russianness is not something that gets traction in Georgian society, and it has its reason. Because since the regaining independence, Russia waged or orchestrated several wars in Georgia, including 2008 war. So being openly pro-Russian is not something that any political party can ride on this messaging. But corruption, fear of the war, nostalgia of Soviet Union, and maybe this cult of Stalin, that resonates with the age group which has some kind of sympathies, but again, it's not predominant. Especially this spring, it was obvious when we saw huge amount of protest in Georgia, where mostly the younger generation who made their first step in the political life, so-called Gen Z, clearly showed that this Russian propaganda and GD propaganda, which are more relies on a traditional values or the so-called Russian style of traditional Orthodox Christianity, uh, tailored in terms of the cultural similarity with Russia, did not work with this generation. So, but also, unfortunately, we've seen that Orthodox Church that has been heavily penetrated since the communist time, and it was part of the KGB operation against the captive nations like Georgians, Ukrainians, Moldova. Even we've seen it in Europe, in the Balkans, for example, in Montenegro as well. It always been used as an additional leverage to steer public opinion in a direction that fits Russian interest. Maybe not openly pro-Russianness, but the anti-Western propaganda is in a parallel supporting the idea of keeping Georgia in some kind of a sphere of influence of Russia. Again, as I said, through kleptocracy, corruption, and propaganda messages of ultra-right nationalist or extreme nationalist messaging, which gets some traction in the society, but not openly pro-Russian. Because in Georgian case, openly pro-Russianness is something that never worked, notwithstanding some initial attempts last several years. So that's why I think Georgian Dream, controlled by Russian oligarch, made a very good tailored propaganda machine to maintain their base or their support base through kind of a corrupted mechanisms and kleptocracy, but also very sophisticated informational campaign that includes anti-Western propaganda. We've seen government-organized troll accounts that were, and the social media has been quite widely used to orchestrate this process with the help of different media checker organizations. We expose this network of unauthentic troll factories paid and controlled by the government. So you could see similarity in terms of technology because they've been operated exactly like Russian troll factories or Chinese troll factories. So it was a government propaganda, while government rhetorically, initially until this moment, were maintaining the facade of pro-Westernness. In reality, they were financing and orchestrating anti-Western sentiments in the society as a fertile ground for them to maintain power.
Thank you, Batu. I'd like to conclude our podcast with a question for each of you, and it echoes what I asked the last time we were discussing this, and why this matters, why Russian political warfare operations against countries that are not even NATO allies or are on the periphery of NATO should matter to listeners in the United States. Because as we read our news and listen to broadcasts, there are many in the political sphere who seem to be channeling their inner Neville Chamberlain and saying that this is not important. And why should we worry, to literally quote Neville Chamberlain, about a country that is far away and about which we know little. So for Batu, I'll let you go first, and then Bill. Why should the average American care about what has been happening during these elections in October?
Let's zoom out a little bit and see this in the bigger picture. What is happening in Georgia, in Ukraine, and in Moldova is part of this same problem of authoritarian united around Russia and pushing against democracy. So this battle between democracy and authoritarianism has a front line, and this front line starts geographically from Moldova, in Ukraine, and Georgia. And there are similar methods of land capture and state capture. And the major idea is to prove the concept that liberal democratic world order is not sustainable. And Russians are trying to offer a new spheres of influence based world order. So, if successful in Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine, we could see authoritarians trying this type of hybrid means of warfare deployed, and they are enabling network deploying in other parts of the world. The 21st century authoritarians led by Russia and Putin is different than the 20th centuries. It's not only the homegrown authoritarians who care only domestic power and they are clinging to the power. They went on offensive. They are now trying to deploy their networks within our democracies. Even well, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine are fragile democracies and more vulnerable, but we've seen these tools deployed in a more established institutional democracies and proved to be quite effective in terms of not only fabricating the problems, but putting oil on existing problems, polarizing society, and making states dysfunctional. So that's why Georgia is more than Georgia, Moldova is more than Moldova, and Ukraine, more importantly, is more than Ukraine. So whether militarily or politically, defeating Russia in those countries will have a very positive effect of rules-based, establishing and consolidating rules-based international order.
Thank you. Bill, what's your answer to the same question?
Well, Moldova is indeed a small country and far away, and many people don't know a lot about it, but it's a country that, since it got independence in the early 1990s, has an admirable record of holding open elections, competitive elections, and respecting the results. And it's always worth supporting folks, peoples, and countries that are trying freely and openly to choose their own future. But on a more practical basis, first, with Ukraine, Moldova is, if you look at the map, Moldova is intimately connected with and important to the success of Ukraine in the war that it's waging against Russia. It's crucial right on Ukraine's southwestern border, crucial to resupply to security of Ukraine's southern and southwestern front. And in that sense, it is an important part, a free, independent, and pro-Western as opposed to pro-Russian Moldova is important to Ukraine's success in this battle. But finally, on a larger scale, Russia's war in Ukraine is not just for territory in Ukraine. The Russians made that clear in the set of conditions that they gave to us in 2021, shortly before they invaded and began the major war. Russia seeks really to upend, to rewrite the rules of the world order, and to change basically the way in which Americans live in the world. Look who Russia is allied with now. They're close to China. They're close to Iran, getting military equipment from Iran. They've got North Koreans fighting for them on one of the regions bordering Ukraine. Russia is in the midst of a larger campaign directed against Western Europe, our NATO allies, and against the United States itself. And without going into the details, if they succeed, we're going to live in a world where Americans are going to be less free and less secure to travel. We're not going to be able to trade as freely, to buy and sell, to get things. And it's going to be a more dangerous world and a more unpredictable world in which American security is going to be at far greater risk, and the prospects for peace far less certain. So all of these are good reasons to support those who are fighting Russia specifically in the region, but against its larger ambitions, which coincide with our ambitions for a freer, more open, and more peaceful world.
Thank you. Gentlemen, I'd like to thank you both. This has been a fascinating, if at times depressing discussion, and I thank you for your insights and for informing our audience as to the state of Russian political warfare operations in the former Soviet Union, specifically Moldova and Georgia. We'll continue to monitor these activities. In early 2025, the Overheard podcast will delve into Russian political warfare operations in the Balkans, and I will bet you that their tactics in that region are similar to the tactics discussed today. So to wrap it up, Bill, thank you very much. And Batu, as they say in Georgia, Didi Madlaba, thank you very much as well. Finally, Didi Madlaba, or thank you very much to our audience. We always appreciate you listening to the Overheard podcast. And we would appreciate it if you would continue to tune in and recommend us to your friends. If you are interested in learning more about what we've been discussing today, please search the FPRI website at fpri.org for additional podcasts and articles on Georgia, Moldova, and why this matters to the United States. We also hope that you'll visit our website and subscribe to our mailing list and to learn of future podcasts. Please also consider becoming a member of FPRI and donating to it to support our efforts to provide the public and policymakers with fact-driven, nonpartisan analysis about the most pressing foreign policy and national security issues facing the United States. We hope you will join us next month for a new Overheard podcast. Goodbye.